Ryan, what's on your radar?
So on Friday, the Biden administration finally announced what it planned to do with the $7 billion worth of Afghan Central Bank reserves that it seized after the Taliban took Kabul. Their plan is to immediately seize $3.5 billion of it and set it aside for the families of 9/11 victims who are suing Afghanistan. The other $3.5 billion is being seized and will be deployed, quote, for the benefit of the Afghan people, according to the White House's executive order. Now, to be clear, we, the United States, constructed the Afghan Central Bank over the last 20 years of occupation. It's modeled on the Federal Reserve, and by law, it's required to be independent of the government. Just like the Federal Reserve, its mandate is to keep the banking system liquid and keep prices stable and the currency stable. So while Afghanistan was under our watch, it was awash in corruption. But the central bank actually performed its role fairly effectively, and it became a model in the region. The bank managed to earn the respect of the people of Afghanistan, and the Taliban has left it independent. Limiting the bank's mandate to liquidity and inflation was essential to keeping it out of the corruption that was all around it. The law was in place so that the government couldn't run up huge debts or steal public money and then turn to the central bank to fill in the hole. And because the government couldn't do that, the bank thrived. The discipline held up until now, which is what makes the Biden administration's latest move that much more shameful. The Afghan Central Bank reserves are, by law, set aside for price stability and to stabilize the currency. That's it. For Biden to raid those funds for 9/11 families destroys the integrity of the central bank. And it's not as if the money will actually go to families. There was already a massive 9/11 fund that was set up to help those families. This is money that'll go to trial lawyers for filing endless motions and lawsuits that'll probably last longer than any of us are alive. It's probably not a coincidence that trial lawyers for decades have poured millions into Democratic campaigns. Okay, so what about the other half? That $3.5 billion is being set aside, according to press reports, for humanitarian relief efforts and according to a summary of the executive order for the benefit of the Afghan people. Now, to seize the money and give it to aid groups would be insane. That would be like shutting down the Federal Reserve and then taking some of that money and giving it to soup kitchens. But the executive order doesn't actually say the money is going to humanitarian relief efforts. So what's going on here? My understanding, after talking to people close to the situation, is the U.S. still might release that half to the central bank. Yet they're also talking about creating a, quote, trust fund. And it's not clear if that's the same thing or not. One administration official put it like this, quote, we will create a trust fund with input from stakeholders, including Afghans, and use money to benefit the Afghan people, which could be many different ways to meet their needs, not just humanitarian assistance. Our humanitarian assistance efforts are separate from this, unquote. Now, as somebody who's often positioned way on the left, it feels strange to me to have to explain to people to my right that, listen, actually, the best thing you can do for Afghanistan is get their capital markets and their banking sector back up and running. And the way to do that is just let them have access to their own central bank reserves. This is so obvious that it is crazy-making. Last week, there was a vote on the House floor just to require the administration to issue a report on the consequences of their seizure of the central bank's reserves. And 44 Democrats and every Republican even voted against that. So my colleague Alex Weatherhead called all 44 of those Democrats, and not a single one gave an on-record explanation for why they opposed even studying the consequences of their actions. Two of my other colleagues, Sarah Sirota and Austin Allman, asked every member they could find outside the Capitol what's been most, and they asked every member outside the Capitol why they voted that way. And so what's been most striking to me in my interviews on this issue is that members of Congress don't seem at all even aware that the issue involves the country's central bank reserves, and that our seizure of those reserves has ground the economy to a halt. And businesses have closed. Importers don't have capital to cover imports. Workers aren't getting paychecks. And if you have money in a bank, you can't withdraw that money. People are burning furniture to stay warm or selling it for food, or they're fleeing the country. So here's a sampling of their answers.
Congressman, do you have a minute to talk about Afghanistan? Are you concerned at all about sanctions and humanitarian suffering there?
Running late, sorry.
Congressman, do you have a minute to talk about Afghanistan?
Real quick, yeah.
I believe you voted against that amendment. I mean, do you think that we should be studying the humanitarian suffering there?
I mean, I think we should study the humanitarian suffering everywhere. Obviously, the humanitarian suffering all over this planet, right? I'm not in favor of giving money that I'm pretty confident will end up in the hands of the Taliban.
Congresswoman, can I ask you a question about Afghanistan? Not about Afghanistan?
What about the shameful withdrawal?
Well, that's a pretty big deal too.
Service members that were killed, about the drone strike that killed many.
Actually, about the millions of children that were starving.
Why don't you go talk to Biden?
I think that matters too, and it's the Biden administration that's doing this.
We're talking about the precipice of a massive famine, or one that's going on, and we have a responsibility to make sure that that our foreign policy doesn't contribute to that.
You have no time to talk about the starving children in Afghanistan. When will you have time? You don't. I mean, it's just a quick explanation. Why did you vote against reviewing sanctions and freezing of assets that's starving millions of people? Aren't the lives of millions of children worth more than that? Do you have any thoughts about the sanctions and the freezing of assets in Afghanistan that are starving millions of Afghans? You don't have any concern? Does it weigh on your conscience at all that thousands of children are starving right now while we sit on our hands? Congresswoman, can I ask why you voted against an amendment to review the sanctions on Afghanistan last week? Just a brief explanation of the vote. Nothing? It's not worth your time at all?
And so rather than starve to death, what most people will do is they will flee. And so we're already now seeing a massive migration crisis. And if we could put that element up, the New York Times is reporting that more than 1 million people have already fled to Iran. And this is such an amazing example of New York Times passive language here. I know Robbie's a fan of collecting their ones. As incomes have dried up and life-threatening hunger has become widespread. That is the perfect passive way to describe.
It's like they're describing a police shooting.
It's a police shooting, right? An officer-involved shooting. Every great empire finds itself involved in such passive language.
Yes.
And such famines.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Incomes have dried up. Real shame. Real shame that those incomes have dried up. How did those incomes dry up? Oh, they were actively seized, and the central bank was halted. I think people should try to imagine what would happen if all of a sudden the Federal Reserve announced, we don't have any capital anymore.
Yeah, no.
It's like, my paycheck won't clear now? I can't get a mortgage? If you're an importer, you can't, the thing that you were importing can no longer be imported. Now you're a small business and you're going to your supplier and they're telling you, we don't have anything. What do you mean you don't have anything?
And that's
we had a deal.
The key difference here is that this is, despite that passive language, this is something being done to them by us. So look, I take the point, one of the Congress members said that yes, there are people starving all over the world, and we cannot help all of them, and it is not the U.S. government's responsibility to help people in other countries proactively, that kind of thing. I agree. But this is not, we have caused this by doing this, by taking their money from them, so we should just give it back. Right. It's theirs. We're causing this. So we don't have to be proactively engaged in humanitarianism or liberal interventionism or whatever. This is different.
Yeah. And apparently, and by the way, the central bank still has, there are I think 7 members on it. Maybe there's 1 vacancy at this point. 2 of those are Afghan Americans. Like, this is a Western creation. Like, the idea that after building this for 20 years, we're now trying to make a new one, some trust fund or something. And so I interviewed one of the American central bankers, and he's like, what are they doing raiding the reserves? Like, the whole idea of this is that it's supposed to be free of corruption. This money is for one specific purpose: price stability, inflation, currency. Like that's it. It's not for lawsuits.
Right.
Because if it's for lawsuits, then why isn't it for this region of Afghanistan had a poor harvest because of drought? Give them $1 billion of the reserves. Like once you open that up, then you start using it for all of these other purposes. And then it's not around to do its basic function, which is price stability, inflation, and liquidity.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Anyway, I hope they end up doing the right thing, but every day.
I doubt it.
and we can talk about this later. Last point, all of these people fleeing to Iran, we probably are happy with that. That's how kind of amoral and gross and nihilistic are just all foreign policy, not just American, but all foreign policy people are, that they see 1 million refugees as perhaps a useful pawn to sacrifice to just destabilize Iran a little bit.
Iran, yep.
Anyway, Team Rising will join us next.